I'm basically going to go over some of the things we do when we're doing on-farm fertility trials. And a lot of the on-farm fertility trials that I've done, soil fertility, has been related to variable rate nitrogen. I've done a bunch with sensor-based variable rate nitrogen, things like the green seeker or the Optrix sensors. Getting more into looking at if variable rate P and K is even possible, and I'll show you some of the work that we're doing on that. It's kind of funny. I don't know if most of you know this, but some dealer and retailer surveys show that about 70% of the phosphorus and potassium put down in the United States is put down variable rate. I would argue that there's absolutely no scientific justification for any method that we use to do variable rate P or K. Universities, nobody's really actually developed a good recommendation system for that. And so I think that is one of the reasons that we need on-farm research to figure some of this out on our own. Conversely, sensor-based nitrogen management as a variable rate strategy has been well documented in the scientific literature. Robert Mullen, who used to be here at Ohio State, developed a bunch of algorithms in Ohio, and yet it's seen almost no implementation on the landscape. So we have this technology that is well documented, scientifically proven, and no one uses it, and everyone is varying their P and K, and there's no scientific background behind it. So that's one of the reasons I think we need some more on-farm research, and I like to see the interest in this area. So that kind of answers why on-farm research. We want to answer questions or maybe validate. We don't believe what someone's telling me. So Josh McGrath just told you that sensor-based nitrogen management will work and variable rate P and K does not work. And not a single person in this room believed me except for Fulton because he believes everything I tell him. So you can go home and find out if I was lying to you. I heard they're recording this. I hate that too because it means I can't lie to you because someone will come back and find out when it's recorded. Convince yourself that these other studies are applicable in your situation and also to kind of supplement that applied research coming out of the universities. I know the folks up here at Ohio State, they're doing great work, but there might be something else on how you want to understand what they're doing in your own operation. So what do you need? These are the bare requirements. Attention to detail, ability to keep good records. We heard a lot about that this morning with some of the apps. I'm going to start using Fulton's apps to lay out all of my research studies. Appreciation for the rigor of research. I throw this one in there because when I start working with farmers, I do a lot of on-farm work, and I always lie to them at first and say that I'm not going to get in the way of their operation. I'm not going to take up their time. It's not going to cost them any money, and it takes all their time, all their money, and they lose yield if they work with me. I mean, that's just a fact. If you work with me, probably it's not going to rain. That's typically what happens. But, there are reasons why we do everything we do in research, and so just having an appreciation for that rigor. Even if you're doing on-farm research, I don't think you can cut some of those corners. And then there will be some necessary interruptions. You can't have painless on-farm research. Anyone that tells you it's going to be painless on-farm research is absolutely lying to you. You're going to have to give up something. Nothing comes for free. And then the nice toys to have, a calibrated yield monitor with GPS. I've gotten to the point where I only believe the hundredths digit on a yield monitor. So if you tell me you got 150 bushels per acre, I figure, okay, I believe that 1 is probably correct. I don't know if the 5 is right. If you tell me 200 bushels, I'll believe the 2. John's laughing at me, but I swear I have no faith in yield monitors anymore. Rate controller with the ability to log applications is nice. Prescription capability in lieu of or to supplement the yield monitor, a grain cart with weight sensors, and also that has to do with how big you want to make your plots. You don't necessarily have to have high-end equipment. This is my research sprayer that I built at the University of Maryland. We've got one of these at Kentucky now. Old spray coupe, Melrose spray coupe is a pretty good thing for us because I can throw it on a trailer and truck it around the state. We made some modifications for research. You can see the side panels are pulled off. When we first got this thing, it was so worn out that we couldn't hit our rates when we were going uphill, so we had to circle all our fields and be going downhill every time. Yeah. And so we put a little 18 horsepower Kohler on there separate from that little Volkswagen that's on it and used that to run the pump so that we could hit our rates a little bit better. Use some variable rate nozzles, put fast switching flow control on it, and that just gives us a bigger range that we can hit without having to switch out the nozzles. And then the basic strategies, keep it simple. Trials require land, money, time. Big trials require more of all those things. And often, yes, no answers are the easiest to address. So that's the entry level. Do I need fungicide or don't I need fungicide? Kind of ignoring the rate. With phosphorus, do I need phosphorus or don't I need phosphorus? Once you get into rates and things like that, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. But you got to make sure your comparisons are meaningful. There was a fellow at the University of Maryland that I used to do some work with, and he would set up these trials, and then he'd come to me with the data after the fact and say, what does this mean? And he'd have like one treatment would be phosphorus and potassium, and another one would be a herbicide, and he wanted to compare them somehow, you know. So you got to make sure that you have these meaningful comparisons. For statistics, I'm not going to teach you statistics because I'm not good at them myself. I get by. But, you know, go to your county agent, go to your specialist. I guarantee you that these folks at Ohio State are interested in working with you and are happy to have people that want to do on-farm trials. Replication is important. We're going to talk a little bit about blocking factors and randomization and how to achieve that in the right way. Include a control or a check, and there might be multiple checks depending on what you're researching. It's not always just one check or one control. And be very conscious of confounding factors. So I'll get into what those mean here in a second. So when we set up blocks, we're trying to separate out the true response from that natural variability. You know, when we run the statistics, you kind of got to stick with the horse you rode in on, in a sense. I was at the National Agronomy meetings last fall, and there was a student giving a talk, and I'm not one of these people that picks on students. I never, ever, ever pick on or raise hands with students, but I couldn't let this one go. He showed this data. I think it was soybean data, and it didn't come out statistically significant, the yield differences between his two treatments. It was 13 bushels, and he goes, well, he says, that might not be statistically significant, but 13 bushels means something to me. And I feel him. I understand. I feel him. But if you're going to do research and you're going to believe in statistics, believe them all the way or don't even try. Right? You got to believe them whether they agree with your worldview or not. Because what statistics are doing, that 13 bushels, if it wasn't significant, my first thought was you did something wrong. You've got a bad plot. You've got an outlier that you need to go back and look at your data or look at your yield monitor point by point at the data and find the bad points. You've got something wrong. But you can't just sit there and say, well, this was statistically significant, this was statistically significant, this wasn't, but it was 13 bushels, so I'm going to take it. You can't pick and choose. And so I kind of raised my hand and I brought it up, and there was a couple of guys in front of me who, you know, as they walked out past me, they were like, 13 bushels is significant. I don't care what that guy says, you know. And I was like, yeah, whatever. You know, I don't care. No, you've got to stick with the statistics because it takes that natural variability out. And if you've got something that looks like it should be statistic, there might be a problem. But you're trying to find that background noise and see if what you're finding is repeatable. A block or a replicate, people use those interchangeably, but we're replicating the treatments in each block. And you want to randomize them within the block. You can't just have treatment 1, 2, 3, treatment 1, 2, 3, treatment 1, 2, 3. You have to randomize them within the block. A lot of people will take and say, okay, I'm going to replicate 4 times in the field. I've got 3 treatments, and then they randomize it across the whole field. But you've got to set up these separate blocks, and you should be blocking based on a factor or an effect. So in this case right here, deer damage along the edge of the field, right? We see yield loss along the edge of the field. Well, we can handle that. Make that one block where you expect to have the deer damage. But don't let your blocks, you wouldn't want to rotate this setup so that half of every block is in the damaged part. Because then you're not blocking across that factor. Does that make sense? You can also block by yield potential or soil type, or separate fields can be separate blocks. So here's soil type, you know, so it's not always perfect. You can see the soil type is crossing down into that block 3. Block 1, there's a soil type that kind of spills over in block 2, but generally we're trying to set our blocks up in separate soil types. And so a lot of times what I would do in a field like this is maybe put a block here, a block over there, and a block down here. They don't all have to be in a line, especially where we can set up variable rate prescriptions for fertility trials. We can make some pretty wild arrangements in the field nowadays that would have been pretty difficult a few years ago. And then once you understand blocking and replication, and typically you want all your plots to be the same size, you can bend the rules if you know the rules. It's like fashion. That's what my wife tells me, right? It's like fashion. If she says, I don't know the rules, so I'm not allowed to bend the rules. But, you know, so here's a block. plot 1, plot 2, plot 3. They're all the same size. They're 12 rows wide, maybe 200 feet long. Well, I do variable rate research with nitrogen. I want to find the optimum nitrogen rate, okay? So I have my green seeker turned on for one treatment, and it's varying that nitrogen rate as I travel through the plot. And I have an average nitrogen rate in that plot, and I have the yield for that plot. And then I've got the farmer practice, let's say over here in plot 3, and that's what flat rate the farmer was going to put down. So I can have this comparison between the farmer side dress rate of 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre and the green seeker side dress rate, which maybe ended up being 100 pounds per acre. But I want to know what the actual right rate was as well, because I don't know if what the farmer was going to apply, especially if it was based on Ohio State's recommendations, was right. I was waiting for some sort of response from the back row, but I didn't hear anything. But so we set up 5 different flat rates from 0 to 200 pounds per acre. And what we used to do was lay them out in full 12-row by 200-foot plots. But that gobbles up a whole lot of the farmer's field. And so what we started thinking about was putting in smaller plots for our rates. Now, it's not entirely fair, because I'm comparing a plot that's maybe 50 foot long to a plot that's 200 foot long, but I'm trying to find that optimum rate. So this plot with the different flat nitrogen rates that I'm making with my controller, I'm prescribing that nitrogen rate ahead of time. They're shorter, but that's kind of a separate study embedded in the study, nested, to find the optimum nitrogen rate. So maybe it's not quite right, but it's giving me that optimum rate, optimum nitrogen rate, that response curve, within the same space as my variable rate plot that's the same length as all of those combined. Steve's sitting back there thinking now, going, this is not right at all. You can't do this, McGrath. But, you know, sometimes you've got to bend the rules. And I'm fine with that. So here's an example of replication. So here I use separate fields to replicate. I put my blocks by field. I put out a bunch of nitrogen rates. By the way, this isn't real data. That's why it looks so good. John always picks on me. I tell young extension specialists, don't mess up a good story with real data, right? Because real data is not good to teach with. It's always really ugly. I just make up all my data with a random number generator. So we set up some nitrogen trials. We do it in 3 separate fields. You could do the reps within the field to look at variability within the field if you just want to look at that space, but typically we want to look at other spaces to find the right rate. The best situation would be is if in each one of those fields I had 3 or 4 reps. And it's okay to drop reps if you have a good reason. So that's back to the example of the student that had a 13 bushel yield benefit, but it wasn't statistically significant. I'm betting there was a plot that just didn't act like the rest. So if we look at this data here, field 3, let me see if I can get the mouse. Ooh, that mouse is really fast. So that field 3 up there, can you see that gray line? Was non-responsive to nitrogen. We got 165 bushels per acre across all nitrogen rates. With 0 pounds per acre of nitrogen, we got 165 bushels. That's actually based on a real data set that I have. All these are actually based on real fields. I just cleaned it up to make it prettier. And that was a really warm, wet spring. We got a whole lot of nitrogen mineralization. We maximized yield without any fertilizer. It happens about 40% of the time. You wouldn't know it because you guys probably not very often have true zero checks out in your field. So you can drop that one that didn't behave, and we can look at the averages. So this is the average nitrogen response curve with that field number 3, and this is the average without field number 3. So we see it changes our result if we include the non-responsive sites. So if I'm looking at nitrogen response, I typically am only going to include the responsive sites in my equation to find that optimum rate. But it depends on what question you're asking. But you want to check for response, which gets us to the question of controls when we're doing fertility trials. What is your control when you're doing a fertility trial? I was doing a study with some university researchers. These were PhD scientists at the top of their career. They've been at this for 30 years. And they were setting up on-farm trials, and they said, let's do 4 nitrogen rates. We're doing them on-farm with farmers. And I said, okay, I'll find my farmers and I'll do the study. And we were talking about what the rates were going to be. And they said, well, let's do the farmer practice plus 25%, minus 25%, and minus 50%. And I said, well, you're not going to have a zero-end check out there. They said, well, no farmer's actually going to apply 0 pounds per acre of nitrogen, so why bother having it in there? Well, the point I wasn't trying to find out what a farmer was or wasn't going to apply. We were trying to find what the optimum nitrogen rate was. The question was important. And so I have to know if that site is responsive. And so these guys were like, oh, no one's going to apply 0 pounds, so why have a 0 pound check? Because I needed to know if the site was responsive. So you could have standard practice, which is what they were saying, that the farmer practice was the standard practice, but that wasn't giving me enough information. Yes, no questions, whether or not to use a fungicide, I can get down with using a standard practice as the check. But it doesn't work with how much nitrogen should I use, because there's multiple possible answers. Which rate is optimum? And I need 0 pounds per acre of nitrogen to confirm nitrogen response. Now, I've done a lot of on-farm trials with plus or minus 50 pounds of nitrogen, but that's kind of a different question. That question is, am I too high or too low where I'm at right now? Not what is the optimum rate. Okay, different question. So it requires rates above and below the optimum to develop that whole response curve. Here's some real data. So 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen, 125 pounds per acre of nitrogen, 3 different fields. Average yield statistically is the same, about 158 bushels per acre. But we needed a check that was at least deficient. Ideally, we would like that no fertilizer control. If we're looking at side dress, it could just be a no side dress control. Sometimes by saving time or space, in other words, we say, well, I can't afford to have 4 rates out there. So I'm going to save some time and some space and just do 2 rates. Saving time and saving space often ends up in wasted time and wasted space and wasted money. That's just a fact of doing research. So in this situation here, you throw in that 0 pounds per acre and you can see that one field was non-responsive, and then we know to throw it out of the data set. More rates helped us find the right rate. This is actually real on-farm trial data. So the bars are yield with the green seeker sensor at the nitrogen rate that was average, 55 pounds per acre, just above 0 pounds per acre. The green seeker was saying they didn't need nitrogen. Yields are at about 200 to 220 bushels per acre. This was late season nitrogen application, so they went in with starter. They probably had about 2 tons per acre of poultry litter. They came in at V4 with a knife rig, coulters, and put UAN side dress in, and then they were coming in and trying to find what's our late season rate that we need to get. You can kind of see a response curve in this field. We'll call it JG. Turns out that there wasn't statistically any difference between the economic return of any of those flat rates that were side dressed late. Obviously, TW was not responsive across the rates that they used, which means that at that knifed-in nitrogen rate at V6, they had enough nitrogen. They didn't need to come in at V10 or V12 or whatever it was with that late shot. And they got about 225 bushels to the acre, and they could have done it without any of that third shot. And the green seeker was basically picking up on that. That 50 pounds from the green seeker was probably just noise because of the way they had it programmed. So in this situation, they already had enough nitrogen, so you've got to be conscious of that. I do a lot of side dress studies. And if I've got a lot of history of manure, so I've got an organic nitrogen source, or I had a lot of nitrogen out before that last application, I'm not going to see a response. So you kind of have to be conscious of what's out there up front or what the background is. The Cate-Nelson approach, so this is one way to look at data. So I have this Fitbit watch. And you know how like you're having a conversation with someone and you've got somewhere to be, and you kind of want to look and glance at your watch without them knowing you're glancing at the watch, and then this watch doesn't come on unless I go like this and shake it for like 5 minutes, so you guys know every time I look at my watch to see what time it is. It won't even come on now. There, 1:50. I can't be subtle with this watch. So the Cate-Nelson approach for yes-no questions. This is some PSNT data, the pre-side dress soil nitrate test out of New England, a paper that was published back in 1990, where they looked at all the plots, 341 site years of data. And what they're doing is they're saying they put plots out with just 0 pounds per acre of side dress nitrogen or a sufficient rate of side dress nitrogen, like 100 pounds per acre. So there was just 2 treatments in all these fields replicated, 341 fields. 0 pounds or 150 pounds of nitrogen, whatever it was. And they're taking the yield with 0 and dividing it by the yield that was fertilized and getting a relative yield. If it's greater than 1, then the check yield was higher than the fertilized yield, right? So typically we try and set that relative yield critical threshold at about 0.93, 0.95, which means I'm getting about 93 or 95% of my yield with fertilizer, right? So we set that critical level at 93 here, and then we try and find that point statistically where to the left I needed fertilizer and to the right I didn't. And so at a soil test of 25 ppm, below that I need to side dress, and above that I don't. And these are on sites that have an organic nitrogen source, like poultry litter or an alfalfa crop in its history or something along those lines. And this is a great Cate-Nelson. It has very little of this error where it says you don't need to fertilize and you do. Like 2% of the sites, 2% of the time it says no fertilizer needed, but you actually did. So it only fails 2% that way. And it's biased because we don't mind recommending fertilizer when we don't need it as much. It doesn't cost us as much to over-fertilize as it does to under-fertilize. Under-fertilization costs more. And so it's about, I think, 4% ended up in that quadrant where it said no fertilizer needed, but you actually did need fertilizer. So, or it says you do need fertilizer, but you actually didn't. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. So that's a Cate-Nelson plot. So this is a good way to look at data for like yes-no questions. Here's soil phosphorus. So this gets into some of the technology we have to do on-farm trials. So this is some stuff that we started doing last year. We want to find that critical level in a very small space for phosphorus. The soil test phosphorus level above which I don't need to fertilize and below which I do need to fertilize. And like I said, I don't have any faith in variable rate phosphorus recommendations, so that was the background with this. So we set up our planter, 2x2 fertilizer, so that we have two separate tanks, polyphosphate and UAN, and we're keeping 50 pounds per nitrogen in the 2x2 across the whole field, because we don't want any confounding factors. And in each one of those dots, that's a 30-foot by 30-foot plot. Every one of those is a plot, and we're taking and splitting that plot up, and in the center, we're putting phosphate at 60 pounds per acre. We're testing out our equipment this year. In the future, we're going to randomize where the phosphorus is in that grid. But there's a 30 by 30 plot with 10-foot cells. We soil sampled every one of those cells, and then we're going to randomize 3 of these squares will get phosphorus. And then we do that 300 times in the field. And we pre-program this all on the computer. We just drive the tractor across the field, and it's turning the phosphorus on and off and keeping nitrogen the same across the whole field. Now, you guys might not want a grid sample on a 10-foot basis. It gets expensive. But this is the kind of stuff that we can do with the equipment, so we did it in two different sites, one out in western Kentucky and one in eastern Kentucky. Interesting enough, just to show a little real data, John, on average, we had a yield response. On average, we had low soil test P. So if we had applied phosphorus across the whole field, it would have paid for itself. But when we look at it on a site 10-foot by 10-foot basis, set the critical level at 95% relative yield, half the time it worked and half the time it didn't work. So that's the University of Kentucky critical level right about there. And when we look at subfield level, our soil test phosphorus recommendations don't work. They're 50% right. We should have just fertilized the whole field to take the variability out of the equation. This is why I'm saying I have some problem with variable rate phosphorus. We haven't quite figured out how to do it because we lack precision in our recommendations. Our recommendations are highly accurate. On average, they're right. They're very imprecise. Every spot in the field, they're wrong. Does that make sense? That's the difference between precision and accuracy. So, how do we measure that yield? This is our combine. It's a 2-row combine. We've got a couple different monitors hanging up in there. We're equal opportunity. We've got Ag Leader and Trimble. You can't see out the window. But because yield monitoring in the small scale is pretty imprecise, we take a lot of other samples. So that's something I recommend in on-farm research if you can spend the time. Mapping with NDVI. Look at your grain moisture. Look at maturity. Count silks to see what treatment silk earlier. Look at plant biomass. Take some early season samples. Look at tissue concentrations and look at soil samples. You need other data besides just yield. And if we're evaluating products, product response versus fertilizer response are two different questions. And we have to be very conscious of these confounding factors. So for the farmer to realize an eternal benefit, the dollar value of the product response must exceed the cost of the product. So all that means is if the product's worth it, if I'm using Fufu Juice #1, I got to get more yield than what it cost me per acre, right? And so yield equals dollars, reduced fertilizer can also equal dollars. It can go either way. So I've made up fake names to protect the guilty. There are 2 products that claim to prevent nitrogen volatilization. Do these products work? So we decided to use our standard practice, granular urea on the surface, and then a known product as our 2 controls. So we have one we know that's going to volatilize, and then ammonium sulfate, which doesn't really volatilize, as our other control. So one should have a lot of nitrogen volatilization, the other one should have very little, and then we have 2 products, No-V and ammonia stop. Typically what I do is apply 150 pounds per acre of nitrogen at planting. That's my normal rate. And we're going to measure yield, and we're going to replicate 3 times in the field. So these are my results of each of the 3 reps. We've got No-V, ammonia stop, ammonium sulfate, and urea. They look pretty similar. When we look at the average yield response, ammonium sulfate pops out statistically significant with 13 extra bushels of yield. So ammonia sulfate looks like nothing worked. Only ammonia sulfate works. Well, what's the problem with this? Why isn't this a good comparison? Sulfur. What I'm seeing is a sulfur response, not a nitrogen response. So we have what's called a confounding factor. We could be seeing a sulfur response. If we're looking for N conservation, then we need the rates in the study. And if we're using a product that conserves nitrogen, we should be able to use less nitrogen. If that's our objective. If we're conserving nitrogen, we should be able to apply less. There are 4 R's, right? Right rate, right source, right place, right time. Okay? Everyone always talks about the rate, but generally our nitrogen use efficiency is pretty low. So if we do anything to increase that efficiency, we should be able to reduce the rate of nitrogen applied, and that's where the money comes from. So if we look at the rates from this study, then we start to see something different to pop out. First we got to apply sulfur to all the plots to take out the confounding factor. And then what we've got is a nitrogen response, because I have a true zero check. So that's my nitrogen response. And all the products, I can use urea to get to my max yield. It's volatilizing the devil out of the nitrogen, but I can get there. I just got to apply up to 200 pounds per acre to compensate for what I'm losing. I can get there by applying more. That's my nitrogen response. My product response is how far can I decrease my rate to get to the max yield. So with No-V and ammonium sulfate, I can go all the way back to 100 pounds per acre versus the 150 pounds per acre. So my product response is 50 pounds of nitrogen that I can save. Make sense? So you've got to be able to separate these things out, and a lot of it ties back to what's the question I'm asking. How would you add the sulfur in this study? How would you add the sulfur to take out the confounding factor? What's a good way? What's that? Lots of eggshells. Other ideas? No. You could use gypsum, but it's moderately soluble, so it's not going to be right away. Sulfomag's probably going to be a little bit more, but you want to use a sulfur product that doesn't have nitrogen in it, and probably something that's readily soluble, which is tough to come by. But you could put some gypsum out a lot earlier maybe and get there. So other considerations. Bring in your friends. More locations means more reps and conditions. Important to determine if a product rate or treatment works over this range of conditions. Plot size, the bigger the plot, the better, but it still has to be practical. A lot of this has to do with how long of a plot you need for your yield monitor to be effective. And sometimes, Bob Nielsen said this once and it stuck with me, sometimes an experiment simply becomes an experience for the farmer with little real impact. I thought that was very meaningful. So you can answer important questions, but you've got to have planning and attention to detail. It's easier with today's technologies, and your extension office can help. I wanted to show you a couple of examples of some actual on-farm research we've done. So manure injection and plus an inhibitor, an incomplete experimental design. So we've got this tool that will inject dry poultry litter subsurface. It eliminates phosphorus runoff, right? And so we figured out that we can use that injector with nitropyrene to limit nitrification also. So basically like N-Serve you would use with anhydrous. So we're treating our poultry litter with N-Serve and injecting it. So we get rid of the phosphorus runoff, we don't have ammonia volatilization, and the N-Serve keeps that nitrogen in the ammonium form so we don't get nitrate leaching or denitrification loss. And so a complete block design would be injection plus nitropyrene, injection and no nitropyrene, surface applied and nitropyrene, and surface applied and no nitropyrene. So that's a complete study, but we didn't have enough space. So we said, well, you're not really going to surface apply with nitropyrene. You can't get the nitropyrene in good mixture with the poultry litter, whereas when we inject it, it's basically a planter. We're basically planting that poultry litter, and so we put a starter fertilizer rig on it, and we're spraying the litter as it's being planted in that kind of like a pop-up fertilizer, but it's nitropyrene. I just spent the weekend putting out one of these trials, actually. Saturday and Sunday we were spreading manure out in western Kentucky doing this exact same thing, but we're going to do a complete block design. We've got more space this time. So we then nested in effect. So our standard practice is to provide about half of our expected nitrogen need with the litter up front. So we nested side dress rates to find the effect of the litter treatment on the injected nitrogen response. So we've got this big plot that's 50 foot wide that's injected with nitropyrene. And in that plot is 5 10-foot wide plots because we've got a 10-foot planter and a 10-foot Calder rig. And we put different nitrogen rates out at side dress within that big injected nitropyrene plot. And we randomized those rates inside the randomized injected and nitropyrene. So we ended up with injected with nitropyrene, surface applied litter, and we did surface applied UAN to get a fertilizer control just to see how it compared to straight fertilizer. Side dress at V6 with 0, 45, 90, or 135 pounds per acre, irrigated site. And then I threw in a zero-end check with no starter nitrogen and a high-end pre-plant of 270 pounds per acre. I'm not going to show that. It was just a little something else to kind of put bookends out there to see where we were at. And what we saw is injected with nitropyrene, we could get the same yield. So this is two different ways to look at the data. So the orange line is surface applied with no nitropyrene. The blue is injected with nitropyrene. So the normal litter, 126 pounds per acre of side dress nitrogen to get 245 bushels to the acre, but I only needed 42 pounds of side dress to get to the same yield with my injected, right? So it was a pretty effective. That's one way to look at it. It was a really effective practice. The other way to look at it is if I had known to go up to the higher side dress rate, the injected with nitropyrene gave me 16 bushels at 100 pounds per acre of side dress N. So the normal litter gave me only 243 bushels to the acre, but the treated injected gave me 260 bushels to the acre at 100 pounds of side dress. So there are different ways to look at data. That's kind of the point of this, and you can do an incomplete design. And we should look at more than means. Here's a field where the farmer's going to do some green seeker trials with us. We had to have a low-end strip out to calibrate the sensor and a high-end strip. You can't really see the high-end strip in the foreground. In the background, you can definitely see that where we turned off the starter nitrogen. Between 2008 and 2013, we worked with multiple farmers using their equipment or ours, that spray coop you saw. And what we did was we set out 5 flat rates, made sure the farmer's practice was in the middle of those flat rates, and then we did 3 different green seeker treatments, which was basically 3 different nozzles with the green seeker varying the nitrogen rate, and we replicated 4 to 5 times across the whole field. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of this data, not a lot. So this is a typical nitrogen response in 2012 on this one farm. Nitrogen rate on the horizontal axis, yield on the vertical axis. We were doing about 45, 50 bushels per acre of corn. Drought, right? So this is what happens when you do research with me, is this is what your yield response to nitrogen looks like. You get no rain. So we get a lot of that we've got to throw out. And then on average, we see that with the green seeker, 20% less nitrogen, same yield between the two technologies, between the farmer practice. So this is compared to the farmer practice. But I like to say we got to look at more than just the average. So in 2010, I picked out a pretty good year. We had 25% reduction in side dress nitrogen rate with green seeker at the same statistical yield as the flat rate optimum. But this is the 7 sites that we did in 2010. So one farmer, we cut 50% below his practice, another just 5%. He was playing it pretty tight. So when I say green seeker will cut your nitrogen rate 25%, I am being accurate. But I'm not being precise. Right? To be precise, on average it's 25%, but it's somewhere between 5 and 50%. Right? So we got to think about how these numbers work. In general, this practice works. It kind of depends on the year. Another way to look at variability can be useful. So this is from last year in Kentucky. We were doing some nitrogen rates with farmers. We set up their equipment. This is one farm, one example. It's just something that I was looking at a couple days ago, and it kind of got in my head, so I thought I'd throw it in here. And so we're looking at average yield across the plot. We basically had each rate replicated 4 times, except for the highest rate we had replicated 8 times. So this is the kind of stuff that happens when you do on-farm research. The farmer got out there, was having trouble hitting one of our rates, the lowest rate, so he just went and switched all those plots over to the highest rate, which is fine. It's perfectly good. You've got to be loose like a long-necked goose when you're doing on-farm research, right? That's what my dad used to always tell me. You got to be able to try and just go with the flow and make things work. So we got more reps of the highest nitrogen rate, and generally we see a trend for increasing yield with more nitrogen. There was no statistical difference between these 3 rates, between the highest rate and the lowest rate. There was a statistical difference. The yield averaged somewhere between 185 bushels per acre to about 200 bushels per acre, so pretty good spread across there, about 15 bushel spread. But what I want to point out is, look at how wide the variability is in yield with those lower nitrogen rates, right? But at the highest nitrogen rate, the yield is really consistent. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to interpret this in your own operation, but this is meaningful to somebody like me. The right rate was 120 pounds of side dress nitrogen. Statistically speaking, the yields were equivalent. The mean yield was the same at 120 pounds as it was at 160 pounds. But the probability that I was going to lose yield was higher down here at the right rate. So we don't just want to look at averages and means. We also have to look at the variability around the mean. The way I interpret this is at the lower nitrogen rates, I can yield just as well as the high nitrogen rates because of soil nitrogen supply and mineralization. But soil nitrogen mineralization is not as predictable as good old-fashioned UAN. Right? If I put the nitrogen there, it's there. If I got to depend on a bug in the soil to give it to me, there's a little noise in that data. What does this mean economically? I don't know. I mean, this is the kind of stuff we've got to figure out through on-farm research, but this is just a fact of life. Here's the same thing that you see. This is the data I showed earlier. Look at the higher nitrogen rates. Statistically, these 4 rates were not different in each of these fields. The optimum rate was the lowest rate. But if you look at the spread, especially on that blue field, you've got much more spread at these lower nitrogen rates in the yield. The mean is the same, but the error bars around the mean are bigger with a lower nitrogen rate. So it's not only important to look at means when you're doing on-farm research, it's also important to look at the individual data and look at the spreads and see if you can learn something from that.